Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Canada Infinite's webinar on emotional well-being through stresses of immigration, settlement, and job seeking in Canada. My name is Shadvari Joyce, and I manage the Canada Infinite program. For today's webinar, we have participants joining us from around the world. Most are Canada Infinite program participants, but we also have some joining us from other pre-arrival programs. So welcome to everyone. I want to give a special shout out to our IRCC program officer who may be joining us as a participant today. Canada Infinite is offered as a free service thanks to funding from Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that and thank them for their support. The process of immigration and settling in a new country is inherently stressful. Add to that the unprecedented scenario of a global pandemic. These are challenging times for everyone, and we all have to build the resilience to sustain and find ways to thrive through these challenges. In today's webinar, we are going to talk about mental health and figure out some strategies to take care of our emotional well-being through this journey. Before we get started, some webinar housekeeping points. Webinar is being recorded. The length is approximately 1 hour. All participant lines will be muted. There'll be a questions and answers session at the end of the webinar. Please type questions in the question window. Please take time to complete our post-webinar survey in the end. An email will also be sent. Recording will be posted on JVS Toronto's blog, and you will hear from your employment specialist if you are a Canada Infinite program participant. We are hosting from home, so please be patient with us. There might be a few technical glitches here and there, or sometimes noises we can't control. So thank you for your patience on that. Here's a quick overview information on Canada Infinite Pre-Arrival Employment Acceleration and Mentorship Program. It is a free national 8-week program delivered by JVS Toronto with other industry partners. We have served over 5,000 English and French-speaking immigrating professionals since 2016. We have dedicated employment specialists who support professionals arriving in the next 12 months with employment services such as employment preparation and job search tools, connection to a mentor in Canada in your profession and province of arrival, resume and cover letter help for Canada, Canadian workplace culture and expectations for success at work, employer and industry experts led webinars like this one, online job matching platform, access to job postings and virtual job fairs. We also offer soft skill sessions on customer service and business writing. This is an overview of today's agenda. We will cover topics like what is mental health and stress, when do we recognize a concern, what can we do, and supports that are offered. And like I said before, we'll have a Q&A session in the end. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lawrence Blake, who is a certified psychological health and safety advisor, program manager, Mental Health Works at Canadian Mental Health Association, Ontario. Lawrence currently manages workplace programming for the Canadian Mental Health Association, Ontario. As part of his role, he regularly liaises with regulators and governments in order to speak on and about mental health in the workplace and the identification of psychosocial risk factors present in the environment. He attended graduate studies at the University of New Brunswick, looking at the experiences of immigrant newcomers and the effects that trauma has on integration. In addition to his role with CMHA, Lawrence has spent 11 years in the Canadian Armed Forces in both Ontario and New Brunswick, serving as an infantry officer. He's a graduate of the Canadian Army Command and Staff College and presently commands a rifle company within the 48th Highlanders of Canada an Army Reserve unit of the 32nd Canadian Brigade Group. In fact, he's just back from active duty where he was deployed to assist with the pandemic situation. Lawrence, thank you for your service and for joining us today. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here. I guess just because I've unmuted the microphone, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, so really what we're hoping to do is take about a half hour to have a conversation together, which means we'll go through the slides and speak to a few of the topics that were identified in the agenda. And then I want to leave as much time as possible for any questions that people might have or queries that might be generated as a result of the content that's going to be presented today. Let's go to the next slide. So the first questions we're going to ask is just, well, or answer hopefully, what is mental health? So define mental health, and then talk a little bit about stress and anxiety. So mental health, I want to point out, is something that we all have. We take a positive approach to descriptors of mental health, which means that despite the fact that we might experience mental illness at some point in our lives or a mental health concern, maybe not reaching that threshold for mental illness or the diagnostic criteria of a mental illness, we all have mental health, just like we all have physical health. And really how CMHA defines mental health is that it's the ability or the capacity to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life. Life, as we live it, should be filled with little moments of joy and contentment. And that when we're able to notice those moments of joy, contentment, we're able to enjoy the things that we typically enjoy. We're able to engage in new experiences in an open and fulfilling way. That's a good indicator that we're experiencing good mental health or positive mental health. It's the ability to work productively and fruitfully. Now, when I say work, I'm not necessarily talking about your job. Some of us are very lucky in the sense that we identify with our vocation, right? We identify as doctors, as lawyers, as teachers, maybe as musicians, because that's what we do for a living. But what I mean when I say work is really, how do you identify with acts of labor? And so you might identify as a teacher, but maybe you just go to teach because that's your job. And really how you identify is as a mother or a father, a brother, a sister, maybe an aunt, an uncle. Perhaps in your spare time you write poetry, and so you identify as a writer. Maybe on the weekends you play in a band at a downtown restaurant, and so you identify as a musician. So what we're talking about here is really your vocation. How do you identify and what do you connect to from a labor perspective? And if you're able to engage in that productively and fruitfully, and it provides meaning to your life and meaning to your community, then that's an indicator of good mental health as well. Finally, good mental health means that we're able to respond to circumstances in a way that is healthful. If I were in the room with all of you right now and I were to ask you to raise your hands if you'd ever experienced stress, some people invariably, because I do this on a regular basis, don't raise their hands. And I like to tongue-in-cheek kind of call them out and say, well, you're obviously lying because we all experience stress, right? I experience stress going to work because of my commute. I experience stress at home because I'm sure at some point during the webinar today, the dog will bark at a dog that's walking down the street. We experience stress on a daily basis. And when we're able to respond to those stressors in a way that's helpful, that doesn't impact our lives or the lives of others around us, then that's an indicator of good mental health as well. Next slide, please. So what is stress? We talk about stress a lot, right? I want to point out, first and foremost, that it's something that we all feel. We all experience stress. In fact, stress is a daily occurrence in our lives. And it's something that's reactive, right? So a stimuli occurs, or we interact with a stimuli, and that causes a stress response. It's also important to note that stress is important to our functioning. I think all of us have experienced stress that was probably helpful in some way, shape, or form, whether that's stress because we're studying for an exam, and that stress caused us to maybe study a bit better or a bit smarter. Maybe it's the stress that we feel immediately before a race or a run if you're an athlete. Maybe it's the stress that we feel when we're going to a job interview for the first time. And that really means that we rock the job interview because we were able to prepare for it a bit because we felt that stress. So stress can be a motivating thing as well as something that's probably deleterious to our health, right? And so when we talk about deleterious stress or stress that has an impact on our well-being, that's the kind of stress that we either want to try to avoid, or if not avoid, at least try to mitigate in some way, shape, or form. And we'll talk about some of those mitigation techniques a little bit later. Next slide, please. So what does stress look like, or what does it feel like? Well, I think a lot of us are familiar with this experience where we perseverate on an idea or a topic. So perseverate really means to hyper-focus on something. An example of this might be that you notice a spot on your big toe, and you're looking down at it, and immediately your brain jumps to the idea that, oh, well, is that skin cancer, or is that something bad that's happening to my health? When in reality, all that happened was you stubbed your big toe walking down the street the other day, or maybe moving furniture around your home or your apartment. And that cognitive distortion that occurs within that ruminative process or that ruminative cycle is a factor of stress. Avoidance of stimuli situations or memories is quite common. And so for many people, stress will kind of be felt as a procrastination or be experienced as procrastination or avoidance. Some of us might experience anger, irritability, or rigidity to change. That can be an indicator that we're experiencing too much stress in our lives or stress that is not helpful. And also, we tend to feel somatic concerns when we experience stress. And so those bodily functions that are quite common to human beings, so for example, the emetic response to anxiety, so that experience where we feel a bit nauseous or a bit stomach upset because we're anxious about something or stressed about something. Perhaps you're shaking, or you're feeling tremors, or you're twitching. Perhaps it's a headache. Perhaps it's just feeling exhausted or wiped. And that's because in addition to the psychological experience of stress, there is a physical experience of stress. So stress occurs along two planes, the psychological plane and the physical plane. Next slide, please. So I want to make a few notes here on the immigrant experience and stress. And the first is that we're well aware that most newcomers to Canada, in fact, to many countries, are healthier than the average Canadian. And so when we say healthier, what we mean is that they report less instances of things like depression, anxiety. It's called the healthy newcomer effect, and that's well documented and well known. The other thing to note is that stress and mental illness are culturally situated, and the experience and the language that you use to talk about it differs across peoples. And I hate to say it, but right now we don't really do a good job of talking about mental illness or talking about stress that is culturally appropriate. The language that we use to talk about mental illness, stress, mental health is very much rooted in Western medicine, very much rooted in the Western experience. And so when we open up tools like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual or the ICD, those manuals and those tools that we utilize in order to either arrive at diagnostic criteria or arrive at definitions of certain things might not be culturally appropriate and might not be represented in the populations in which we work. The other thing to note is that the mental health system can be quite opaque and difficult to navigate, not only for Canadians, but also for newcomers. And so one of the hopes at the end of today is that we can kind of talk a little bit about how we can better navigate that system, advocate for ourselves, and also access services that are going to help us along our journey towards good health. And then finally, access to services in one's primary language can be a challenge. We have two official languages here in Canada. Those languages are English and French. And it can be difficult to translate services into languages that are going to be helpful for the individual that's trying to access a service. So we're actually going to talk about a program that's being rolled out nationally at the very end of the presentation that hopefully alleviates some of those barriers and mitigates the harm that can be caused by having non-culturally appropriate services. So next slide, please. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that COVID-19 and the current SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is having on our lives, and certainly the impact that it has on stress. So first and foremost, we are being asked to maintain physical distance from one another as part of that effort to flatten the curve. I I really disliked early on in the pandemic, we were talking a lot about social distancing. That was the term that experts were using. They're saying we need to socially distance from one another. And I disagree with that entirely. I think, it's one thing to physically distance from one another, but we should actually become more socially connected in times of struggle or times of hardship. And so while we might maintain some physical distance, 6 feet apart, maybe wearing a mask if you're a bit closer than that, we need to become more socially connected because that's how we maintain health. Many of our collective meeting places have been closed, whether voluntarily or because the law has said that they must close. And so those places in which we find community, integrate with community, engage with community, either no longer exist because they've closed permanently or have been closed temporarily. We fear just for our own health, the health of our loved ones, even the health of strangers. And so there might be a reticence to meet with people when it's acceptable to do so, just because we don't want to get others sick or get ourselves sick. And then finally, if the first three are kind of the carrot, the things that we do just as good citizens and good community members, there have been laws that have been enacted to physically separate us in order to ensure that our health system can keep up with the demand that might be placed on it given the current situation. And so COVID-19 has added layer upon layer of stress to our lives, and I think we need to acknowledge that and recognize it. Next slide, please. So how do we recognize a concern? We're going to go through a few things just about how we recognize that we might be struggling with something, and then what we need to do in order to mitigate that struggle. Next slide. So some things to look out for just in yourself. First and foremost, a lack of interest in activities that we used to enjoy. So an example of this is I know that I'm experiencing a tremendous amount of stress if I have difficulty waking up in the morning, going out for a walk or going for a jog. If I find myself kind of immediately jumping on to my emails on the phone in between brushing my teeth and taking a shower, and then I rush to work and immediately hop on the computer to check emails again and start sending them. That's a pretty good indicator that I'm experiencing stress. Other indicators might be things like you don't want to go out to see a movie with people, and usually that was something you did every week or every month. Maybe it's that you don't meet with friends on a regular basis. So there's things that bring value into our lives, we start to lack interest in them. Next is irritability, often at small stresses or inconveniences. So if you picture a cup, right, and that cup is your capacity to handle stress, when that cup begins to overflow because we've piled on too many stresses in our lives, that's when we start to become really irritable, or we start to have a stress response. And we talk about this in the terms of fight or flight or freeze. And so if you find yourself getting angry at people easily or getting ticked off, or you find yourself maybe wanting to avoid certain situations or certain things, that could be an indicator that you're experiencing a tremendous amount of stress or anxiety. Withdrawal from community and work can be an indicator. And so what this really looks like is maybe you're not as engaged at work, maybe you're procrastinating a bit more, maybe you're not as engaged at home, and you find yourself not wanting to cook a meal or not wanting to go out for a walk with your partner, play with your kids. That could be an indicator that stress is an effervescent presence in your life. Negative thoughts, so that tendency to catastrophize, we mentioned that earlier, but propensity towards perseveration about those negative thoughts can really be a pretty strong indicator that you're experiencing a lot of stress, or potentially even moving into the realm of experiencing a disorder associated with anxiety. And then poor coping mechanisms certainly are something that are looked for in a clinical setting. So things like substance use that might be harmful or might be maladaptive. Things like gambling, so those process-based engagements that could lead to addiction, and certainly other poor coping mechanisms such as self-harm, or perhaps avoidance, or perhaps getting into arguments or fights with loved ones or friends. Next slide, please. And so what we teach at the CMHA, and certainly within a clinical setting, what a practitioner will attempt to do is recognize, first of all, that thoughts, feelings, and actions are a cycle, they're a process. And so as we begin to think about something, we begin to feel something, and that will produce an action or produce a behavior. And so what we want to try to do is, because we can't change feelings, we can't just sit there and say, I want to change how I feel. We can change how we think, and we can change what we think about, and we can change how we think about things or think about events. And what we can also change is how we act with certain things. And so if we can change our thought process, and if we can change how we act, we actually start to change how we feel. And so by taking those steps in order to really critically interact with our thoughts and with our actions, we end up changing how we feel, and that can have a tremendously positive effect in our lives. Next slide, please. So how do we change how we think and how we act? Well, it's more difficult than it sounds, obviously. And so we're going to give you a few options that might be helpful. So some immediate actions that you can take, virtual coffee and tea with a friend. We put together this particular slide very early on in the pandemic. And I actually had a friend in the military reach out to me and say he was really struggling with not being able to go into work, being kind of cloistered at home. You know, he said, you know, can we do a virtual coffee? Can we just meet for coffee? We'll put on Zoom and we'll have a chat over the course of a half hour. And I thought this was a really excellent idea. And then I recognized that a lot of people were doing the same thing. And so this idea that despite the fact we're physically separated, we can actually take some time to meet with people and do the things that we would have typically done, which brings some normalcy into our lives, but also connects us socially with another. Because as social beings, we require that in order to maintain good health. You could write a letter. First of all, historians are recommending this because of this particular moment in history in regards to the pandemic. And that letter could be to a friend, to family, to your housemate. And I really encourage you to write this letter with pen and paper, or pencil and paper. And the reason for that is because there is something tactile about doing that. More than just sending a text message, there's something that's thoughtful. There's a contemplative act that goes into that writing of a letter, and that can be tremendously helpful and tremendously soothing when you're doing it in order to connect with another. And then finally, try to find moments of joy in solitude and practice those contemplative acts of self-compassion. We're going to talk in a second about mindfulness and what that means, but really my definition of mindfulness is pretty broad. It's really just any contemplative act of self-compassion that we engage in as part of a practice in order to arrive at a more healthful solution to a problem. And so those moments of solitude, when we find ourselves maybe experiencing a bit of loneliness or experiencing a bit of isolation, we can find moments of joy in those too. An example of this is that when I walk down the street and I see dogs, just people out with their dogs, walking their dogs, that gives me a little perk up, and that gives me a little moment of joy in my day. And when we're able to recognize those things, we're actually able to put our feelings and our actions into context. Next slide, please. So what is mindfulness? Really, mindfulness is all about noticing what we're sensing. That's through our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, our tongue, and being able to control and shift your focus into the present. If there's one thing that I like to say about anxiety, is that anxiety is always worry about a future state. It's worry about a future self, and we place ourselves into that future self, often a future self that has had something catastrophic happen to it. And by being able to control our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions in this moment and recognize what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, we're able to remove ourselves from the universe of bad possibilities that exist within the walls of our skull and just focus on the now, because often the now is pretty safe. It means paying attention in a particular way to certain things. So do a purposeful scan of what's going on right now. You can engage in certain grounding activities. Certainly coloring is an example of that. Yoga might be something that you engage in. Exercise, so running, going for a walk, going to a gym can be a mindful practice. Meditation, often a thing that we conflate with mindfulness, is just one example of mindfulness. And a tool that we might use in a clinical setting is something called 5 things you see, 5 things you feel, 5 things you hear. And so what we ask people to do when they're practicing this is find a quiet space in your home, in your apartments, maybe at the office or at your work. Sit down in a comfortable chair or on the floor. Take a big deep breath in, hold that for 3 seconds, and then name 5 things that you can see. And so that might be a tree outside the window. Then you're going to take a big deep breath in, hold for 5 seconds, breathe out again, and then list another thing. And then you'll list 4 things, 3 things, 2 things, 1 thing, and then you'll switch to things that you can hear. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, things that you can feel. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And again, what that's helping do is helping remove you from that catastrophe that you're thinking about, that you're perseverating about, putting you back into your own physical body, in the physical space in which you're currently in, and then allowing yourself to relax. And this is for two reasons, because the exercise of noticing these things is impacting or combating stress along the psychological plane. And then those big, deep breaths are helping impact the physiological response to stress, right? So impacting stress along the physical plane. And that's helping to lower those stress hormones, cortisol and epinephrine. It's helping to reduce your resting heart rate to a level that's more manageable. It actually reduces blood pressure. And so those physical symptoms that start to emerge as we experience stress are mitigated as well. Next slide, please. So I want to make some notes about mindfulness, and first and foremost, that recognize that it's a marathon and not a sprint, that it takes practice. And so there's a reason why we call mindfulness a practice. It's not something that we do in a moment just when we're really stressed. It's something that we should practice every day, because it's like a muscle. And so just like you go to the gym and you're not going to expect you're going to become a bodybuilder after one trip to the gym, it's going to take a bit of practice to build a muscle. Mindfulness will take a bit of practice too. And so really treat it like a practice, treat it like an exercise, and every day do a little bit of this. And so when you do require it in a moment of high anxiety or high stress, it's going to be more effective. Make sure that you recognize too that it doesn't need to be a 40-minute meditation session. It can range in 1 to 3 minutes. It could be at the end of every day, you take 10 minutes to journal about your day. Those are all examples of mindful practice. And first of all, I want you to recognize finally, or I should say finally, I want you to recognize that even short episodes or periods of mindfulness can really decrease anxiety, increase your cognitive function, reduce distractions in your life, and greatly improve your mental well-being and mental health. That, by taking 10 minutes out of every day just to practice this, you're better able to deal with stressors as they arise down the road. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we recommend utilizing when it comes to mindful practice or paying attention to stress on purpose is something called the Big Four. The Big Four was developed as part of the Road to Mental Readiness program from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, as well as the Department of National Defence when it was creating the program. It's since been exported to a variety of professions, so that's firefighters, police services, paramedical services, educational institutions, and even just restaurants and the public sector practice the Big Four. It derives from sports psychology, and it's 4 steps that we can take in moments of high anxiety or high stress in order to not only improve the outcome, but also improve how we feel about the process. The first step is something called SMART goal setting. So that means setting a goal that is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So when we say specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound, what we mean is, as opposed to saying, I really want to do well at work, that's kind of an amorphous goal. It's difficult to contextualize that. It's difficult to picture that. Try to picture a goal such as, I want to hand this report in by Thursday so that on Friday I can just catch up on some emails, and my weekend I'm not worrying about what I need to do on Monday. And so once you have that goal in your head, submitting the report on Thursday, I actually want you to move into step 2, which is rehearse how you get there. So visualize what all the intermediate goals are that lead to that goal of handing the report in on Thursday. And more importantly than just visualizing what those intermediate goals are, visualize what success looks like at each step. Because if there's one thing we know and understand about stress and anxiety, it's that it's really difficult to visualize what success looks like when we're hyper anxious about something, when we're activated, when we're stressed about an outcome. And so by just visualizing what success looks like along those small goals on the pathway to the final goal or the end state, we're better able to recognize that, well, we probably will be successful because we can picture it. The next step is positive self-talk. So as you're visualizing these intermediate objectives or these intermediate goals, I want you to really say great things about yourself, great things about your abilities. Ideally, do this out loud, because this now becomes an active process as opposed to a passive process. And the reason we want you to do this is because by telling yourself that you're capable, that you're able to do this, that, the outcome won't be as bad as you think it is, combats the tendency that we all have towards saying really negative things about ourselves when we're stressed or we're anxious about something. And we've all been there before. We're studying for an exam and we just start to tell ourselves, you know what, we're not capable of doing this. We're not capable of passing the test. We're not capable of passing the course. We're going to get a terrible mark or a terrible grade. We're not going to graduate on time. We've probably all been there before, whether it's in high school, secondary school, or in post-secondary institutions. We've probably done this at work for a job interview or for a project that we've been working on. And so just by saying that we are capable, saying that we are able to achieve those intermediate objectives and then finally achieve the end state, that really does combat our tendency towards, perseverating about negative things. And then finally, I want you to practice arousal control. So when I do presentations in Canadian workplaces, that invite us to come in and talk about psychological health and safety, the national standard for psychological health and safety, I always tell them that they're breathing wrong. And this isn't me being tongue-in-cheek. Well, it kind of is, but it's really what it's saying is that we're not practicing deep breathing. And so when you're practicing deep breathing, what I want you to do is imagine your stomach is like a balloon. And as you breathe in, you're going to expand your stomach. It's not going to suck in towards your spine. That's taking a very shallow breath. You're not engaging the diaphragm at that point in time. And I want you to hold that for 5 seconds. Allow the blood to flow through the bronchial tubes of your lungs, oxygenate itself, reach your brain, reach your limbs, reach your muscles. And then after you've held it for 5 seconds, I want you to breathe out through your mouth. And as you're breathing out through your mouth, your stomach isn't actually sucking in towards your spine. It's just slowly relaxing itself. And what that helps to do, if you practice deep breathing, again, it lowers your resting heart rate. It reduces those stress hormones that are starting to flow throughout the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, epinephrine, cortisol. It lowers your blood pressure. It helps to relax, smooth muscles throughout the body, and you'll start to notice it has a calming effect just by breathing, in addition to the other 3 steps, which are helping to combat stress or anxiety along that psychological plane. Next slide, please. So some other supports to look out for in any community, first and foremost, peer support groups. So peer support groups can be incredibly helpful. They take a variety of forms or functions. Often psychologists' offices will have some form of peer support group that might be either very low cost or perhaps free, depending. So it's important to look out for peer support groups. Many of us are familiar with a version of peer support, which might be found in the 12-step system, right? So for people that attend Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, those are versions or variations of a peer support model. Community supports are another thing to look out for. So try to find mental health services or just community groups or organizations that connect you with a community of whether it's like-minded individuals in the form of a hobby, or perhaps a community in the form of a population-based community, right? Or a community based around a people's or a shared experience in a culture. Those are all things that have a tremendous positive effect on our mental health. Local mental health services are an important support to access. And so that might take the form of walking into a branch of the Canadian Mental Health Association. We are the largest community mental health services provider in the country, with branches coast to coast to coast. So across not only the north, but also on the west coast, the east coast, and throughout central Canada. And then there are other community-based mental health services that we encourage you to access either once you arrive or if you're already here to seek out. Primary healthcare providers can be a tremendous resource. So this means looking for primary healthcare providers that might either be skilled or trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, or might be willing to refer you to a practitioner who is able to provide something like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or some form of motivational interviewing. And then finally, private counseling is something that anyone can access. Of course, there is usually a charge to private counseling. However, it can be incredibly helpful if you're looking for either resolution of a concern that's existed for a little while, or you want to develop a relationship with one person who is able to help you navigate problems or navigate concerns throughout your entire life. Next slide, please. So one of those programs that I wanted to highlight is a program called Bounce Back. Bounce Back's been around for a little while. It started with the National Health Service in the UK and was brought over to Canada by actually CMHA-BC, so the British Columbia division of the Canadian Mental Health Association. It then moved to Ontario, and recently, just this past summer, it's been announced that Bounce Back will be available across the country, so across not only the north, but in every single province within Canada. And this is a free guided self-help program that's grounded in something called cognitive behavioral therapy. So really one of the therapy or practices of therapy that we find to be most helpful for things like mild and moderate depression and anxiety. It's available to anyone over the age of 15, and it helps them guide them through a CBT process via a coach. So you'll connect with this coach via telephone or video link, and they'll walk you through a series of workbooks over 8 to 10 sessions that help you deal with a discrete issue. So that issue might be you want to quit smoking. It could be that you want to deal with anger a little bit better. It could be that you want to reduce your alcohol intake. It could be that you recognize that you're dealing with maybe mild or moderate depression, maybe mild or moderate anxiety. And it helps you work through those feelings by really combating or changing how we think and how we act and taking actions in order to change the way that we feel. One thing to note is that it's pretty quick turnaround. So after being referred into the program by a primary care provider, you'll get your first call within about 5 business days. And it's also available in over 17 languages. So when I go into workplaces and I talk about the program, I always say it's available Arabic through Urdu. You can access the program. So most of the major language groups here in the province of Ontario, at least, and certainly around Canada, it's accessible in. There's no travel required, so you do this from the comfort of your own home, and it's also available at times that might be more convenient. So instead of having to combat work and try to find a time in between 9 and 5, so the typical work day, to see the doctor, you're actually able to talk to the coach over the phone, who is supervised by a clinician at 7 o'clock in the evening, maybe earlier in the morning, whatever works for you and whatever works for the coach as well. The other great thing about the program is it's, well, free, but you can self-refer back into the program after completing your 8 to 10 sessions. And so if you find yourself noticing that, maybe after a month of completing the first 10 sessions that you're still not at where you want to be, you can call the program back and say, hey, can we start the process again? And they'll re-engage you in the process. So it really is an iterative process. It's not meant to be final, that after those 8 or 10 sessions that you have with your coach, you're able to re-enroll back into the program. Next slide, please. If you happen to be in Ontario, one of the things that we really love to point out is Big White Wall. Big White Wall is a free peer support group that's 24/7 in nature. It's supervised by trained counselors 24/7, and this allows you to connect in a peer support manner with others who might be experiencing similar concerns or similar struggles. Because the site is monitored 24/7, it does provide you with kind of that support network that if you really are struggling, someone will reach out to you and make sure that you're okay and connect you with a service that might be relevant to you. The one thing that I always say to note about Big White Wall is that sometimes you find yourself communicating with people that respond at really odd hours of the evening, say 2 or 3 in the morning. And this is because, again, this is a program of the National Health Service. And so we have friends that are actually communicating with us from the UK. And so just be cognizant of that sometimes there are odd hours where people respond, or sometimes they're talking about things that might not be relevant to the Canadian context, but are certainly relevant to their context within the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. So I really want to thank you for listening to me for about a half hour. It's been a pleasure, and I'm here available to answer any questions that you might have. I encourage you to go to the website at the bottom there at canadainfonet.org if you have any questions about what they do. And then also I really encourage you to check out the CMHA, so that's cmha.ca, where you'll be able to be directed to community supports that exist within whatever community you find yourself living in. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was amazing. There was a lot of information that I'm sure our participants today will take back with them. Being an immigrant myself, I cannot stress the importance of creating a network for yourself, a support system for yourself when you immigrate to a foreign country. It doesn't have to be Canada. We're just talking about immigration in general. Because I immigrated many years back, but there's a lot of things that we take for granted when we are living in our home countries. And when you come to Canada and realize that that's been shaken, especially your friends and your family circle, because many families immigrate here without much connections in the community. So you have to have a strategy for it. So I would say if there's one thing that I can say during this webinar, it would be that for your professional network and for your personal family health, have a strategy for how you will create these connections. It could be like Lauren said, it could be like hobbies that you pursue, or professional communities, or religious communities, or ethnic communities. It could be anything. Plug in somewhere, have a strategy for it, and that will support you, that will help you go a long way settling down in Canada. That said, there's a lot of questions coming in. Lawrence, I wanted you to kind of give us more information. One of the points you mentioned was that newcomers, it's been proven that newcomers are healthier than average Canadians. And I was wondering if you could give us a bit more information on that, because is the reason that we people who are looking to immigrate from other countries into Canada are probably a lot more driven, a lot more, their awareness level of things is at a different level. So that's why research shows this, or what is the reason for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So that healthy immigrant effect, so that's what it's called, or that healthy newcomer effect that we see in a clinical setting. There's a lot of debate around this, and the debate kind of takes two tacks. The first is probably part of that is that many nations, so regardless of where you're coming to and where you're coming from, many nations have certain selection criteria, right? And so people that experience chronic health concerns, or people that experience severe mental illness often are ineligible for immigration. And so we kind of self-select out people that might be experiencing mental health concerns to an extent that would be noticeable. And so that's part of it. And whether or not that's a good thing, or that's something that we should be proud of, I think that certainly contributes to that healthy immigrant effect that we talk about in an academic sense. The second is that are we asking the right questions, I think, is the other thing to ponder. And so when we talk about the healthy immigrant effect, and I mentioned earlier on, things like the diagnostic and statistical manual, so the manual that's used by practitioners, particularly psychologists or psychiatrists, to diagnose mental illness, is written in such a way that it is based upon the Western Eurocentric experience. And so because it's written in that way, do we use language that maybe precludes people from seeing themselves and how we talk about mental illness, seeing their communities and how we talk about mental illness? And that might preclude us from necessarily understanding what the burden of illness is amongst first-generation Canadians. What we do know is that second generation, third generation, there is no difference in the experience of mental illness, that about 20% in a given year will experience the symptoms associated with that clinical threshold for diagnosis, not necessarily be diagnosed, but certainly experience the symptoms associated with diagnosis. And that about 1 in 2 to 1 in 3 over the course of our lifetimes will experience mental illness at some point. And that's just that's a reality that as human beings we will all experience what we characterize as mental illness. Just how we describe it, how we talk about it might differ based upon culture, based upon background, based upon nationality. And that's probably what we're seeing when we talk about the healthy immigrant effect, is not only that, like you mentioned, really newcomers are quite driven to succeed, quite driven to integrate into communities, quite driven to meet new people, find work, meet friends. When we're action oriented like that, we tend to put off feeling things and put off really that introspective kind of inward turn that can result in maybe hardship, or maybe feelings of stress or anxiety. And so it's in second and third generation newcomers that we often see those concerns start to arise. So while it's a recognized phenomena from an academic perspective, I think there's a lot of unpacking that needs to be done further by research and by connection with diverse groups and diverse cultures.
Great, thank you. How big of a stressor is immigration? Like if you say on a scale of, let's say on one end there's workday stressors, regular reports have to be submitted kind of stressors versus a pandemic on the other end. How big of a stressor is immigration?
Well, so we know it's a tremendous stressor. When we take a look at kind of a hierarchy of stress, right up there is, you know, at the top of it are things like death of a loved one, a spouse, a child, a parent, divorce, so separation from a partner. And then right underneath that is immigration or emigration. So the process of moving from one place, one community into another. So we understand that it is a tremendous stressor. It's a tremendous stressor even for people that are just moving within Canada. So for example, moving from Quebec and to British Columbia, that's a tremendous stressor for people. And so we need to recognize that just the process of uprooting oneself and moving into a new place, a new society, a new culture, a new community, having to meet new people, having to go to different schools, having to go to different types of work, produces stress. Now, like we talked about before, stress isn't always necessarily negative. Stress can be quite positive. And so I think it's, we don't want to problematize the experience of immigration, but certainly we should recognize that you will experience stress just by moving. And then there's a layer on top of that when we talk about immigration to a new country. And so recognize that, recognize when you might need to take a step back and just take a breath, go for a walk, spend some time with family, connect with people who matter a lot to you. Those are all things that can help us navigate the process.
Absolutely. I think that self-awareness can make a huge difference. Absolutely. So you gave us a great tip on writing a letter. I really, for me, that I would try and definitely follow that one. Thank you so much for that. Volunteerism is an important Canadian value. And so if you could just share your experience with your voluntary service, and because volunteering can also be an important tool to maintain mental health while job searching, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I've spent almost 12 years in the military now, both full-time periods and then part-time periods, and certainly recently I spent about 4 months working in long-term care facilities when the request for assistance was submitted by the province of Ontario. I led a company of soldiers into a variety of homes in the eastern GTA. And I find tremendous meaning in that work. Not only meaning in the sense that, you know, what we train to do is obviously defend Canada, defend Canadian values, both at home and abroad, but just tremendous meaning in serving Canadians and serving people who live in Canada, right? So when I say serving Canadians, I mean the broadest sense of the word, that everyone who lives in Canada right now belongs in Canada. And so when we talk about serving Canadians, we're not just talking about serving, you know, Canadian citizens. We're also talking about serving permanent residents. We're talking about serving refugee claimants. We're talking about serving our Indigenous colleagues and Indigenous neighbors that live here. And what I connected to is I often every couple of years go back to a book that I read called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And in that book, there's a poem, and he talks about work. He talks about labor, and I'm going to misquote him here, but he says, "Work is love made visible." That even the bread maker is conducting work, making bread, baking bread as an act of love, not only for himself but for his community and for his family. That the temple priest is a temple priest because they are committing to an act of love for their community. And so we should really recognize that. And I see volunteerism, whatever form that takes, whether it's, you know, active service in the military, whether it's volunteering at a local food bank, whether it's volunteering with a youth group or a community group, that is an act of love for community, and it connects us to a purpose that is greater than ourselves. And I think as I recognize that, or I appreciate that as a Canadian value. I think it's more than just a Canadian value. I think that's a universal value that all peoples experience. But by engaging in activities like that, you bring meaning and perspective to your life, and that meaning and perspective has an effect that will help to mitigate stress and help to mitigate psychological pain or discomfort. So I really encourage anyone that's coming to Canada to not only seek out volunteer opportunities. I had the privilege of meeting our Minister of Defense actually quite recently, and I know that there's exploration about inviting permanent residents to enlist within the armed forces if that's something that they so desire, and so that might be coming down the pipe in the near future. That was a surprise to hear that come from him. So I think whenever someone arrives here, it's really important to think about how you can give back and what giving back gives you, because it does give us something too, right? There's a bit of a selfish nature to giving back.
Excellent, absolutely. We have some couple of questions on the physical manifestation of stress. Like someone wants to know if physical ailments like hives on the skin can, or inability to sort of wake up in the morning, get out of bed, those are all part of stress.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a variety of physical symptoms that are associated with stress. We listed a few very common ones, like that emetic response or that nausea that sometimes comes with stress. For individuals that experience autoimmune conditions, so lupus, scleroderma, perhaps psoriasis, flare-ups of those autoimmune conditions will occur in periods of high stress. For people that have been infected with the herpes simplex virus, so you get a cold sore. Cold sores will happen in periods of high stress. So I would see no difference to hives. So that certainly can be a stress reaction, right? That is the body's way of showing that it's under an intense amount of stress.
What about lethargy and like sleeping more?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I kind of characterize stress as like treading water, right? So if we're treading water too long, we start to get very tired, and it's exhausting. And so if you find yourself in periods of high stress and you're unable to take a step back from that, eventually your body will stop and it will tell you you need to rest. And so the inability to get up out of bed in the morning could be an example of that. The inability to engage in exercise could be an example of that. Those can be symptoms of other things too, like depression, and certainly stress can lead to depression. So it's important to note, how you are on a typical day, or how you are on a typical month. And then if you find yourself experiencing more bad days than good days, and over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, that's a good indicator that maybe it's time to talk to someone. Maybe it's time to take a step back and try to figure out what's going on in your life and how you're interacting with certain things within your life. But yeah, lethargy and the inability to get up out of bed in the morning, you're sleeping a lot, those can all be signs of stress or something else too.
Absolutely. This is a very important question, I think. It's there's one way to deal with short-term stresses, but there are times when life can take it to a whole new level when you see consistent sort of things not working out for you consistently, like long-term unemployment, failure to get like desired jobs, which can go on. Sometimes people have to face that. Do you have any tips for dealing with that situation?
I would say any of the tips mentioned are kind of universal and can be universally applied. When it comes to sorry, the direct question was kind of job seeker stress.
Yeah, like long term, if you've not found something for a long term, like how do you cope with that kind of consistently not being able to find employment for yourself and situations like that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would really encourage, again, I think it comes back to that idea of volunteering, is if you're one of those individuals that really has trouble with idleness, right? You have trouble not working, not being engaged in a project, not being engaged in a task. So during the job seeking process, I mean, certainly treat it like like a full-time job, right? That's one of the recommendations that is always given by career counselors is treat finding a job like a job. But take moments to volunteer, take moments to connect with community. There are certainly organizations across Canada that have job seeker kind of peer groups where you can connect with people who are in a similar position. It helps to feel as though we're not alone in that process, right? I know that when I was transitioning from working at divisional headquarters into trying to find a civilian job, I felt quite dejected for a little bit because I was having a lot of trouble trying to translate skills that I had learned into skills that civilian employers would want to see, and that it really helped to connect with people that were experiencing a similar thing. So I knew that I wasn't alone, that there wasn't something wrong with me, that that's a universal experience for many. The other thing to recognize is that the skills that you have and the background that you have are something that you own and something to be immensely proud of. And so just because that one interview didn't go as well as you wanted it to, and maybe they didn't recognize what those skills meant to you and meant to community, that doesn't negate the fact that your experiences and your expertise and your background and your previous work are negative. They're absolutely not. That everything that you have done in your life to this point is something wonderful because it's gotten to you here. So I really encourage you to.
You just have to wait for the right employer to recognize that. It's just as simple as that. Sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. That's an excellent point. You had mentioned earlier about bounce back, and you mentioned that a referral might be required to be part of that program. Where do people get these referrals from? Where do they get
so right now, it differs across the country because we obviously, as part of a federation, different provinces treat things a bit differently. We're exploring right now opportunities to not just have a primary care provider refer into the program. So an example of that might be a walk-in clinic. Once the program is rolled out, so early days right now because the announcement was just made nationally, but we're hoping that we make the program more accessible by having a variety of practitioners that are able to refer into it. And the only reason for that referral process is because we need someone to be responsible for the clinical care of the individual in case the program isn't right for them or in case they need a different type of intervention, right? So the program needs to be able to reach out back to a doctor or back to a care provider to say, hey, we think the person maybe needs more intensive therapy, or we think the person might need to attend to a hospital because they're a risk to themselves or they're in danger of harm. And so that's why that requirement for referral exists. But once you access the program, you can self-refer back into the process multiple times.
Great, thank you. This will probably be one of our last questions. This has got to do with how we communicate with family. And this question is for couples, it's suggested that you don't talk about work. How do I talk to my spouse about issues without burdening them?
So by no means am I a relationship counselor or a relationship expert. So I'll answer this pretty broadly, but I think it's important to have open and clear lines of communication. That one of the things I've certainly found helpful in my life is being able to go to my partner and talk about my concerns, my hardships, what's keeping me up at night or making me anxious, because that gives context into how I'm behaving. If I feel or I seem more withdrawn, there's a lot of white space in between that act of being withdrawn and what they actually interpret it to mean, but what it means to me. And so by being open about how you feel, I think that's a very useful thing for any relationship. And it doesn't always have to be with your spouse. Maybe you just need to find a really good friend that you can talk to as well, right? So there's a universe full of people out there, and your spouse or your partner is one of them. And you should certainly be open with your spouse or your partner. But there's also friends, there's also community groups that you should seek out, engage with, and commit to involved conversation with as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Lawrence. That was a very insightful webinar and Q&A session. I'm sure we will all benefit by learning to be more self-aware and taking steps like mindfulness to take care of our mental health. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.